phantoms and monsters. They exist among us, and sometimes they win. Even the devil was an angel once. The world has its own rules, and these rules are not human. Some of us seek answers to the origin and existence of cryptids and the unexplained. Join us as we venture beyond the known and accepted boundaries. Welcome to our nightmare. I think you're going to like it.
Hello, folks. Welcome to Phantoms and Monsters Radio. I am Vincent Richardson, your host. Co-hosting this evening will be Bernadette McDaniel. And we got something fun for you guys tonight. A little bit different than the usual. Would like to say happy birthday to Mr. Lon Strickler today, everybody.
Yes.
Happy birthday,
Happy
Lon.
birthday.
He is not with us today, but he is on the mend and at home and in good spirits. Speaking of spirits, it is Halloween, and I've got a great show for you guys tonight. We have the scariest of all artists, Mr. Sam Sheeran will be joining us today. And also tonight we have our lovely Anna Marie Manilow, who will be joining us, and she's got some creepy stories for us. And then we've got Dr. Dean Bertram. I think that's Dr. Dean. I saw somebody else in the back.
I think so.
Looked kind of creepy. But anyway, guys, I'm going to bring you all in here.
All
And
right.
welcome to the show.
Hey.
There we go. Oh, my God.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween. How are you?
Good. I'd be muffled if I did the show like this, so I'm probably going to have to
Take it off.
reveal my
Put
equally
it back
scary
on, put it back
face.
on.
But there we go. There we go.
Well,
It was
wonderful.
good,
We
though.
are
I
one
liked
short.
Well, I'm
Ron
glad.
Murphy will be joining us here in a moment. But anyway, I want to get started with you guys. How is everyone doing this evening?
Perfect.
Great. It's the Halloween season, the spooky season. So fantastic.
Tis the Halloween season.
Ever closer.
Indeed. I'm sorry, Sam, I didn't hear you.
I said ever closer to Christmas.
Ah, yes. Yes. And Sam is actually got some really cool Christmas artwork too. I'll be putting some of that up here in a little while. Anyway, I wanted to get on started and start talking about this little campfire thing we've got going on tonight. I guess we're going to go around and tell stories to each other. The scariest things that may have happened to you personally or someone you know. And that
That sounds like a plan to me.
Mm-hmm. Who would like to start with a spooky story for us tonight? Not everybody at once.
It's like all the little
Oh,
kids who
I'll
went step
go.
forward.
Yay! Anna.
Okay.
Yay.
Okay, so I want to tell you this while it's fresh in my mind because this was just about 3 weeks ago when I was overseas. And some folks don't know this. I go overseas almost every year, but it cramped my style, the whole thing with the pandemic. So I got stuck home for about 2.5 years. And then finally, I ended up going to the original destination. In this case, my husband and I wanted to go to France. Now, a lot of people think, oh, gosh, it's so beautiful. And it is, don't get me wrong. But there's some really remote, lonely spots. And because we're on a budget, we don't necessarily go to the most popular spots. If anything, we try and head out for kind of like the places that people normally don't go. So what we do is we rent out a cottage. And in this case, we ended up renting out a cottage that was kind of like off the beaten path. It was very rural where we were. And we stayed there for about 3 weeks. This happened probably during the final week that we were there, and we were just starting to get comfortable. The cottage, if I may explain, is situated on a hill. And around the hill are all these wooded areas. And there's only a neighbor, probably about maybe 100 yards from us. And they're fenced in. And then there's another neighbor down the hill from us. Yeah, that's apropos, Vince, the way through the woods. Different country, though. I think this one is in Germany. The story I have is in France. But anyway, to try to make a long story short, since I tend to go on, and I'm not going to try and bore anybody. behind the cottage that we stayed in, and when I say cottage, it's a 2-bedroom, basically. It's like really small. It's like probably 400 square feet, if that. It was just basically a place to stay. Behind us is a path that leads into the forest. And eventually you get into a canal. Now, the canal, I would say, is probably maybe 8 feet or 9 feet wide. And Vince, I know I sent you a picture of that. It looks nicer in the daytime, believe me, and very calm and very quiet. But here's how the story begins. My husband and I had a bedroom that was on the first floor, but there was also a bedroom on the second floor. And for security reasons, we decided to stay on the second floor bedroom, which happened to have a huge window overlooking the path that led to the canal. And in that particular window was a curtain. And then you had like these real, you know how like in the US you have shutters, but they're only decorative? Well, over there, the shutters actually work. Sam, you probably can relate to this. You could take the shutters and actually close them. Well, we didn't close them because it was still warm. So this was actually open to the elements. And we kept the air conditioner off. And it must have been like 2 a.m. I felt a light shining in. So it woke me up from a dead sleep. I get up. I walk towards the window, which is probably, I would say, give or take 30 feet from the edge of the bed. And I look out thinking somebody turned the street light on. Well, there really isn't a street. There's only a path, a very narrow path. And then where there would be a street light, there wasn't anything, but there was something that was shining, or I would have to say pulsating through the trees. And I have no idea what that was. And if you see the pictures there, you'll see it's really pretty wooded. There's the path that I'm talking about. And it's at the end of that path through those trees where you see the canal. But anyway, I couldn't discern where the light was coming from. I didn't really get any particular feeling from it, except, you know, when you have your window open, you hear night sounds, and there was none. Okay. And it was still pretty warm at that time. So I headed downstairs to get a drink of water. And next thing you know, my husband got up because the light seemed to be getting closer, and it woke him up. So he came downstairs and said, "Is there someone outside? There's this intense light outside." I looked out the window again. We still couldn't tell what it was. We let it go. Morning came. And then we met the neighbors, who happened to be British. They were expats from the UK, Sam. So they've been living there for probably about 9-10 years. And so we were able to converse, you know, because sometimes when you're in a part of the country that's kind of remote, the people only speak French. In this case, they only spoke French, but we were very glad to hook up with them. So they invited us over. You know, we had some tea and things of that nature. And then we got to talking. And they said, "Have you experienced anything strange?" And then we brought up what happened the night before. And they said, "Well, not to alarm you, but we normally take this path and walk towards the canal, and we've stopped doing that. And we'd like to caution you probably to refrain from doing something like that." So we asked, what happened? What is going on? And they said that just about a few weeks before, they were walking out there. They had a flashlight with them because it was getting dark. And they were just taking a leisurely walk after dinner. And in Europe, they eat dinner around 7 or 8 p.m. So we're probably talking around 8:30, 9 o'clock at night at this point. So it is getting darker. They were walking down along the canal. And if you see that picture, you'll see there's trees all around. There are some homes, but not many. And they start to see what they thought was almost like a cellophane or saran wrap that was kind of glimmering. Okay. And it was ahead of them a few feet, and they were walking towards it, and they stopped, and his wife turned to him and said, "Did you see that?" And he said, "What is it? Someone coming towards us with a flashlight?" And she said, "No, it's something is moving out there, and it's almost like a piece of cellophane. Maybe somebody dropped trash and now it's flying out." And she said, "No, I'm telling you, it's got 2 feet and it's walking." So they couldn't quite discern what it was, and they kept walking. And then suddenly, whatever it was that she was seeing splashed into the water and proceeded, and she could see almost like feet rippling the canal. And you could hear the water splashing as whatever it was crossed. But when you looked up to see where the splashing was coming from, there was just kind of like this shimmering or glimmering that was going in and out. Anybody know what that was?
Well, I guess we hear about similar things in some of the missing 411 stories that David Paulides has recorded, for example. There's the relatively now, I suppose, famous case of Bruce Maccabee's wife. I should know her first name, and I don't. And she was out hunting in a tree stand, and she saw something in front of her, which she described as being somewhat like that effect we see in the Predator films, much like what you described, something shimmering. There's a figure there, but it's not there. And I've heard those stories more and more recently. It seems to be something which more people are experiencing. What it is, I have no idea, but it seems to be attached to a number of different anomalous phenomena.
Like it's straddling 2 different planes, basically. Like it's here, but it's also wherever it comes from. That's how it sounds like to me. So that's very scary. Yeah.
Yeah. They had no explanation.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Oh, someone even say that some cryptids have the ability to go like that, to turn translucent. So who knows what you saw?
Well, we did not wander down there. We went over in the heat of the day and took some pictures. I wanted to see if there was any kind of suggestion of footprints or anything, strange or out of the ordinary at all. All I noticed was there were some canoes there, and it seemed like when you look at the water line, the water used to be much higher, and now it's lower than it used to be. The area around it is very quiet. You could see some maybe roofs of houses, but there's nothing there. If you're walking down there, it could get very lonely at night. And I could just picture them just walking down this canal and seeing this shimmering that they don't understand. They have not walked there since then. That when they told us, they cautioned us to don't walk there at night, because whatever it is, we can't figure out what it is.
Oh, wow.
That's spooky.
Yeah.
Definitely a good story to kick off our campfire Halloween roundtable. Yeah. Wow.
That's very, Makes you wonder what's under the water.
Yeah. What is under the water?
Yeah.
Fairies.
Any questions from the chat? Fairies?
Fayfo.
Could be the Fayfo.
Has to be.
I've never heard of them under the water.
That's appropriate for this time of the year. No, the old Irish tale says that when they fell from heaven, wherever they landed was where they stayed. So that's why you get That's why you get the fair folk sometimes in water areas, because that's where they landed, supposedly, according to the old Irish tales. And I think that's a great tale to kick it off, actually. I wasn't going to tell a personal story, but I was going to talk about the fair folk a little bit, because at this time of the year, of course, we tend to think of ghosts and witches and demons and those kind of creatures. But back in the old countries, back in Scotland and Ireland, at this time of the year, what you were primarily concerned of, although you were aware that the whole veil was down, so the dead could be looking in as well, but what you were primarily concerned about was the fairies, the other crowd, because this was the time of the year, just as May Day on the other end of the calendar, or May 1st, which was when they would be traveling between their summer and winter residences, between their forts, as they're called in Ireland. So you could go out any night of the year, essentially, and probably not be bothered by the fairies, although it's not like it's the only time that they appeared, but you certainly had no business going out on November Eve, going out on October 31st, because everybody knew that's when they traveled. So there's a real irony today, because Halloween is the day that people do go out later at night. You know, it's when children are going door to door and wandering dark streets. But if you go back to where so much of these traditions started from, that was the night you battened down the hatches. And there's an irony, of course, because those people were far closer to the origins and far closer to the creatures that started this kind of mythology, and they knew better than to be out on those evenings. So perhaps when you're going door to door with your children this Halloween, it might be worth keeping an eye out over your shoulder, because it is meant to be the night these things are out and about, and you don't want to cross their path. Or so my ancestors would have told you in Ireland and Scotland.
Ooh.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, like, that makes a good point, Dean. Like, they could probably be out with us trick-or-treating as well, because they would be out causing mischief and other things, and they would just blend in.
Yeah, who knows what that little figure that you walked past that you thought was, you know, a child in costume was something else. And of course they have glamour as well. They can appear whatever they want to appear like. So there's this idea, I think, that they're going to be like Tinkerbell in Peter Pan. They don't look like that at all. And they don't normally look like that even when they show their true selves, but they don't often show their true selves. You're as likely to be sitting next to somebody in a restaurant that could be one of them. That's what somebody told the great folklorist Eddie Lenihan, who went out and interviewed hundreds of people about continuing fairy folk in Ireland over the last, several decades, or probably last 4 or 5 decades. And one thing one old man told him, which he said really stuck with him, was that, when he talked to them, what do the fairies look like? He said, you could be sitting next to one at the pub and you wouldn't know. They can appear however they like. So, yeah, you wouldn't know. You're right, Bernadette. If you passed one on the street on Halloween, you'd have no idea.
That would be something, though. Like, you're sitting down somewhere, and, yeah, you could be sitting next to one of them.
That's a spooky thought.
Right?
I'm sure Mr. Sam is cognizant of most of this type of lore as well, hailing from the British Isles.
I mean, yeah, I grew up in and around the whole folkloric mythology and the romance behind it all. But yeah, you're very right there with it. It could be anything. They could appear as anything. They could be as large as a troll, considered as a fairy, or as small as a frog, or riding a frog. I mean, there's so many different stories. It's just the spectrum to put them all under the category of the fae or the chi or the other ones, as you say. It's fascinating to me because this appears in every culture around the world. And it makes you wonder, if all these people are seeing something, they have to be seeing something, because they can't all be lying and making it up, because all the stories are so similar. It reminds me of a story I was told. It's a very brief story, but I was staying with my girlfriend at the time in Wales many years ago, maybe 15, 16 years ago. And we were visiting her parents and staying there in a little cottage that they had, which had been a converted vicarage. So it's a lovely little place in the middle of nowhere, of course, surrounded by rolling hills and forests and valleys and things. So perfect place for strange, unusual beings or creatures or fae. And one evening we had dinner with her parents at their house, of course, and they invited a chap, a neighbor from a local farm down the road, maybe. And I'm not going to give you the real name, but let's call him Malcolm. And and we had dinner, and we were all sat around, just sort of reaching for the potatoes out of the bowl, and filling up the orange juice and whatever, just catching up on things. And this was, height of summer. And my girlfriend's dad whispered in my ear, "You should ask him about the little green men." And I said, "What?" Because he knew I was fascinated by, anything strange. So I said, didn't want to embarrass him or put him on the spot, but I just quietly asked him, I said, "I believe you have a story about little green men." And of course, I'm initially just thinking aliens, because that's where your head goes when you think little green men. But that wasn't what it was at all. In fact, I mean, really, there's no explanation as to what it was. But he swore, and this is the bit that really got me, he swore that he was washing the dishes and looking out of the kitchen window that was in front of him above the sink. And he saw 6 or 7 inch tall little people stood on the windowsill looking in, watching him wash the dishes. And he dropped a dish into the sink, splash, and froze and just looked at them. And then they ran off in the blink of an eye, off the windowsill and into the bushes. And that was it. That was the all of the story that he could tell me. And I pestered him as politely as I could to get any more information out of him. Were they wearing clothes? He would not talk about it. It was almost as though he was scared, because they'd visited him at his home. He said he'd never saw them again. He didn't know what they were, but he swears as the sun goes up and down that there were little green people on the windowsill watching him wash the dishes.
Fascinating.
Gosh. It's interesting.
Bernadette, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's interesting that Sam said when they mention little green men, of course, the first thing that comes to one's mind is aliens, because that's been the term used so much, although now it's probably little grey men, but little green men was the tradition. But of course, before the 1940s, when we became conscious of that term, the late 40s, 50s, of little green men meaning aliens, of course, little green men indeed meant the fair folk or the she or the other crowd, because traditionally they were often garbed in green for starters. So you wonder if somehow we were cognizant, even when we were throwing what we thought was a science fiction label on these entities, if we still knew that somehow they really did belong to that tradition, if the aliens and the she or the aliens and the fae or whatever we want to call them weren't really so far removed from each other.
Yeah, there's lots of parallels and similarities there, of course. It all goes hand in hand, doesn't it? People going missing time, children being disappeared and returning years later, much older. All kinds of stories are so similar between alien abductions and, of course, fairies abducting children, people who fall asleep in the woods, strange sounds, strange lights, magical lights. It's all the same thing, I think.
I agree.
Yeah, I agree with that. Absolutely.
And it makes you wonder if they were still watching him, but he just didn't see them anymore. Like maybe that was just a one-off where they let their guard down and, got caught, basically.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, what scares me, if we want to get the chills up our spines, is how long have they been watching him? Were they watching him at night? Were they getting into the house? Have they always been? Did they visit him since? Or were they just passing through and heard the clanking of dishes and water and thought, what's that? Were they just curious, or had they been there all along? And maybe for a moment just forgot to put their little shimmery invisibility cloak on or whatever.
It's interesting that you mentioned that kind of a long visit, watching someone, the same person, because in alien literature, they talk about how families for generations are watched
Absolutely.
by aliens. And for some reason, they get tagged and they study what they're doing. Some of them eventually do get abducted. I mean, I don't know how we tell the difference between something that's an alien visitation, or it could be, as you said, could be a fae or elemental type of visitation.
Yeah. I mean,
or are they the same thing? Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
well,
the way
if they
I
are
lean, Vincent. Yeah.
coming from somewhere else, that's definitely points
Sure.
to the same thing.
Right.
Yeah, we tend to always physicalize or literalize these things. So we have to now imagine they're from out of space. And we perhaps, when we were more immersed in fairy lore, we had to believe they came from the fort or they came from the hill. But maybe outer space and the hill are the same thing. Maybe they come from a space next to us, but which isn't ours, and they come in and out. And maybe that explains, like I think Bernadette was suggesting before as well, this shimmering effect might be them, with 1 foot in our world and 1 foot in theirs.
It's interesting. That's a good point you bring up there, that we always tend to, especially these days, we try to explain a mystery with another mystery. And I think if we're going to consider that aliens and fairies are the same thing, then of course these days we have to explain it some way. And the best way to explain it is to have something so far flung out that we can't prove it, i.e. it comes from space, that, oh, well, that's the answer. Then now they're coming from another planet, whereas before, as you say, they just came from the forest. Now
Sure.
we've explored forests and we can explore the forest. If this strange thing, these visitations happen, now we tend to lean towards, well, they must be from further away that we can't explore.
Absolutely. There's no unknown territories. It's like the movie King Kong. It kind of made sense when it was made. I think it made just pre-World War II, because there hadn't been a battle on every island in the Pacific. You know what I mean? But after World War II, there really were few places where we hadn't trodden. So as we go forward, I think that's where there's also the popularity of secret US bases holding aliens underground or holding flying saucers, because they're the new forbidden territory that we can't tread. So you're right, we either have to put them in outer space or we have to put them as part of the national security state. But it might be in some ways far more complicated, but far more simple. It might just be somewhere we don't understand that they're from.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And I also think maybe in a way it's like we're protecting ourselves too. Like our mind's protecting itself, because we can say, well, it's not coming from, the forest anymore. It's coming from outer space. So this way it's further away. It can't hurt us. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Like whereas, our ancestors were like, it's the forest. So we're going to stay out there or be careful.
Out of the forest.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think that's the way of our minds protecting ourselves, from realizing that it's something beyond our control, beyond ourselves.
I think that's also one of the most frightening things as well that you're pointing on there, is to sort of, we automatically think, oh, fairies. Let's say, for example, you're washing the dishes and you see some little green people on the windowsill. All of a sudden, your brain almost snaps, because you think that's not supposed to exist. Whereas you might be able to accept aliens. Oh, they're out there. We're not alone. But for little people to be on the windowsill, that's too much for the brain to sort of really wrap around. And I think we do try to make things a little safe for ourselves and more comfortable by explaining it away. Whereas when you're presented with little green people on a windowsill, fairies aren't supposed to be existing here in this time, this day and age. What's going on? That's terrifying to me.
Yeah, the idea of something looking in one's windows is always terrifying. The little green men story, and your point that they're outside what we would expect an alien to look like, or we expect the other to look like. I remember in a Jacques Vallée book, he talked about somebody, the man might even have been washing his dishes as well, but I know he looked out of his kitchen window and he saw what was like a half man, half scorpion on his front lawn. And Vallée took this report quite seriously. The man was absolutely, obviously flabbergasted and shocked and stunned. And how do you process something like that sitting on your front lawn looking at you? It's easy. Now, it'd still be scary if a Bigfoot was on your front lawn looking at you, but we can kind of process that. We have a space we can put that in. But little 6-inch, green man or, or a scorpion man on your front lawn, how do we process that?
I remember being 5 years old. I told this story on Where Did the Road Go with Sarai Asghaf, maybe
great show
7 years ago or something. But I remember being around 4 or 5 years old, and me and my mum were about to go to the shops in England. And I just leant over a wall and I looked down, and the wall was a drop of maybe 6 foot. And I looked down and there was a green grasshopper. But But the weirdest thing was, it was, and it sounds ridiculous, but it was about a foot long. Now, of course, when you're small, things appear to be much larger. But the really strange thing was, is it turned its head. There's sort of like an insect that sort of swivels the head, and it had an old man's face. And so,
Goodness.
I immediately ran inside and got my mum and came out, and I was saying, there's an old man. He's a grasshopper, but he's got an old man's face.
Oh my God.
And she said, "Oh, come on, the shops are going to." It was gone, So yeah, that's pretty terrifying. What was that? Was that a fae? Was that just a grasshopper with a man's face, or was it a cloud? An incredible imagination.
I would have been scared of that. I won't lie. Oh my gosh.
No, he didn't say anything though.
I think it's
They
those
didn't
kind
say
of
anything to you. I
reports-
was about to ask.
Get off my lawn.
Right.
I
You're a
think
real
it's
boy
those
now,
kind of-
Pinocchio. Ah.
I think it's those kind of reports that point to how strange the anomalous really is, and they're the ones which are often ignored by the more mainstream books that want every, a mainstream cryptozoologist who believes that there are flesh and blood apes running around North American woods wants to only put stories which seem to back up that in it. Just the same way as, a ufologist who believes we're being visited from outer space and there's some type of genetic breeding program that the Greys have been doing. They only want stories that fit exactly into that narrative. So things like that grasshopper you experienced, they're traditionally just ignored. What kind of books, include those? But you've got to wonder how many of those type of reports are out there, those totally over the top, totally high strangeness accounts that don't fit anything out there.
At first, I thought it was a toy until it moved. I really thought it was a big plastic toy grasshopper. So I was really curious. I was going to grab it and be like, "Oh, cool! I found a new toy." Until it turned its head and it had an old man's face. So, yeah, I'll leave that one there.
I've seen
Right? Yeah.
I've seen like little miniature things around my house at once upon a time. I've seen these things a couple different times, but it looks like you would say maybe 10 inches tall, and they've got little arms and legs pumping as they run off, little conical head, but it was like a dark green, brown, black color, and I've seen it in the house, and my family's seen it in the house too.
That's terrifying.
Yeah.
Day or
I've seen
night?
two
or
of them
both?
at one time. I have no idea
this-
where they're coming from or where they're going.
Day,
Just ran into
daytime?
the drawers. Yeah. Yep. Daytime. You saw it,
Cool.
turn and run around. His little arms were pumping. It was wild.
Wow.
What's that?
Yeah.
I don't know.
You need to invest in multiple cameras inside your house.
Yeah. Yes, I do. I should.
Yeah.
This house is
You should.
really bizarre. It really is.
Yeah. That would be scary.
Did you
And
just move
especially-
in there, Vince?
No. See, this is the house I was raised in, and we've had like spirit traffic before, but nothing. I mean, I don't ever recall seeing any little guys running around when I was a kid. I don't know. Did they follow me home from California or something? Who knows? I don't know.
Yeah,
You might be
They could
safer
have.
out on the road on Halloween. It might be safer to be outside of your house.
Exactly.
No.
Yeah, find a bar.
We have a ghost cat that we see a lot. I think that's what we see the most, besides the shadow thing. But we've got like a ghost cat, a gray cat. Doesn't look like any cats we've ever had. And I do have cats, so right away I'm like, was that one of my cats? But no, this thing.
Mhm.
Me and my father cornered it one time up in their bedroom. Okay, and he swore up and down, I got the cat. I finally got the cat, and we're like, well, what's going on? We go up there, and he's got the door shut, and he's like, you go that side, I'll go this side. We're gonna get this cat finally. And I saw the thing under the bed. It was a gray cat, and we started to go after it, and we never could get it again. I saw it the one time up there, and we didn't see it again.
Was it even a cat?
Yeah, right. Who knows? It could have been that little guy. I don't know.
Could have been.
Well, as Sam said before, they can
Is
present
it a
themselves
cat
any
you
way they
had
want.
before? Was it alive at one point?
No. See, no, it's not a cat that I recognize. So,
Mhm.
and we do have like a little pet cemetery out in the back, but nothing that
Okay.
I've ever seen.
Big detail there.
It's our pets, so it's like only like 5 animals, but it's
Yeah,
a ferret,
that
a couple
might be,
cats, and a dog. Yeah.
That might be your answer. Yeah.
Did you
Like,
climb up the hill and go further through the trees to see if you could bury other pets up there?
Well,
Have you seen
Oh.
Stephen King's Pet Cemetery?
yes, I have. I didn't do that. No.
well, something dead is better.
Right. Oh my gosh. So I guess it's my turn since Vincent already went. It's my turn. So
Yeah, I jumped in there. Sorry.
no, you're fine. No, you're
Go
fine.
right ahead.
So this is going to be totally different than fairies and everything else. This is personal. This is something from my family. So when I was growing up, my mom and grandmother would always like have this argument about this woman named Helen. And I didn't know because I was little. You don't know these things when your parents or your grandparents and everyone argues. So as I got older, I asked about her, and my mom, it was just me and my mom looked at me and she said, I hate that woman. I wish we had never met her, all this. And I'm just like, what? So she told me my grandmother had always wanted to be able to read tarot cards, see the future and all this, because my mom was very good at tarot cards. And so Helen was apparently a tarot card reader. I use the term loosely because that's how my mom used it. So my grandmother went to her, and my grandmother just worshipped her, strangely. Okay. And we have a dog. And so
Sorry about that.
It's okay. So my grandmother was like, my mom was like 17 or 18 at the time. She was like, you have to come and see her. She is wonderful. You're going to love her. She'll read your tea leaves. She's amazing. And I was like, whatever. Okay, I'll go, So she went to Helen's house, and my mom said, when I stepped inside, I never got so sick. She said the entire house was painted black. I'm like, okay. She said, except for her daughter's room, which was painted pink. And she said Helen had hated her daughter. I said, okay. And so my mom said she got her tea leaves, read by her. And she said, I didn't believe a word she said to me. And she said, she looked at me and she said, you think I'm a fraud, but you're going to see the truth soon. And my mom said, she outright called her a fraud. And she said the cup she was holding flew out of her hand, smashed into the wall, hit the ground. It didn't break. And yeah. And so, my mom said to my grandmother, we're leaving. You're coming with me or you're staying, but I'm leaving. And so they left. And this was Pittsburgh. This was where it took place. And so they're driving over one of the bridges to get back to the house. And my mom said it was a cat that ran out in front of the car, and the car spun and almost went off the bridge. And my mom just turned to my grandmother and said, it was her. I'm never going back there, and you're not to go back there. My grandmother said, well, I'm going back there. She's a wonderful person. She promised me all this, blah, blah, blah. And my mom was just like, I want nothing to do with you. I want nothing to do with her. Okay. So that was the beginning. And then, so I learned that my grandmother was very friendly with her up until the point, my mom found out her daughter, Helen's daughter, had committed suicide off the same bridge. Okay. This was maybe 2 years later. There was no reason, no rhyme. The girl just committed suicide. So then Helen died, and my grandmother was very insistent in going to the funeral. She's like, you're going to take me. I have to be there. My mom's like, I'll take you, but I'm not going in. So my mom takes her. My grandmother goes in. My mom locks the car. She's like, I'm sitting here. I'm locking the car. Don't want nothing to do with anyone. She said everyone was walking past. This guy comes up, knocks on her window. I was like, okay. She puts the window down this much. She said he was the best looking man she had ever seen. He looked like he stepped out of a magazine. And he said to her, because my mom went by Bernie, he said, "Hi, Bernie, we've been waiting for you." Mom looked at him and she's like, yeah. She's like, "I have never met you before. Who are you?" She's from Pittsburgh, so she said something more colorful. And she's like, he's like, "Why don't you come in? It's a party, we're all friends here. Come in." And I was like, "No, I am fine right here." She said, "I'm waiting for that one in there. When she comes out, we're going home." And he's like, "You don't know what you're missing." He's like, "But I'll see you soon in a few years." And my mom was like, "Yeah, okay, sure." And so after the funeral, my grandmother was always insistent about this. I didn't know what it was till my mom told me. Helen had this book. And I remember my mom saying it was a leather book and it was very nicely made and everything. Her husband, Helen's husband, had taken it and ran off into the woods with it. And the book and him were never seen again. Nobody knew what happened to him. There was no record of him. And they never found the book. And my grandmother always said that Helen promised her that book. That book was meant for her. And my mom blew it off. So a few years before my mom died, she kind of looked at me once and said, "Did you ever notice how your grandmother's face would change?" I said to her, I thought about it. At first I said no, because I brushed her off. And I'm like, "Not really." And then I thought about it. And I said, yeah, it would. It would change. One minute she would look like, some of the pictures. And the next, she would just look like a totally different person that I didn't even know. And it was just the worst thing. And she ended up passing away. And it was the worst. It was the worst thing. But my mom did see that guy again. She did end up seeing him a few years later. Yeah.
And what happened when she saw that guy again?
So what happened, and it was very strange. So she was working as a nurse, okay? And she was working with another nurse, and the nurse had asked her for a ride home. And everybody my mom worked with was like, "Don't give her a ride home. She's weird." And Mom's like, I'm going to give her a ride home. It's like right on the way. It's going to be fine. And my mom gave her a ride home. My mom said to me that the lady's name was Betty. She's like, "Betty never gave me directions, but I got to her house." She said it was in the project complex. She said, "I never got directions, but I got to her house." And I'm like, okay. And she said, so Betty invited me in. She complained that like her kids never came around. They didn't like what she did and who her friends were. And she said to my mom, she's like, "Do you want to see a really neat trick?" And I was like, okay. So because they were in her house. Betty pulls back the rug and opens like the floor, and she pulls out an almost identical book to what my mom had said Helen had. And she set it down. Way. She said the pages started turning and everything. And my mom's like, "You know what? I'm glad you made help." She's like, I don't want anything to do with you. I don't want anything to do with this. I'm done. So I think it was a few weeks later, my mom goes into work and they're like, you're up on this floor, but it's a secured floor. And my mom's like, "Why? Do we have prisoners in? What do we have going on?" And like, just go up there. You'll see. She walks on the floor. There was her. There was another male orderly who was studying to be a priest. There was 2 other nurses and a security guard sitting outside the door. And and the floor was basically vacant. Other than that, they had moved all the patients out. And my mom was like, "So is it a VIP? What's going on?" And the one nurse said to her, "It's Betty. They brought Betty in and she's bad." And my mom's like, what do you mean she's bad? And the orderly who was studying to be a priest said to her, he said a couple things, and he's like, "I'm not going in there because when I go in there, she freaks out. She's already snapped restraints. We've restrained her by 4s. I'm not going in there." And I was like, "You're overacting. I'm going in." She went in there, and she calmed down when she saw my mom. My mom's like, what's going on? And she's like, I don't want him in here. And my mom said she started speaking in tongues. She started hissing. And my mom turned around and was like, yeah, she said to Orly, you need to leave. He stood outside the door. My mom was like, what happened, Betty? You know, what drugs did you take? And she looked at my mom. She said, I didn't take any drugs. She's like, they're coming to get me. Don't let them take my ring. And I was like, well, no one's going to take your jewelry. You know how the boss is. We're all family here. You're fine. She's like, no, you don't understand. They will do anything to get me. And my mom was like, okay. So she said it was like 6:00 when she came on. So as the night wore on, they shut the floor down. You know how in the hospital they shut the floor down. She said the doors started flying open. The doors were slamming. The monitors were going off, flatlining. Okay, she kept snapping the restraints. She said, so around, I think it was midnight, she said that the doors opened and 2 guys walked in. And they just walked around the entire nurse's station. They didn't see their faces. They walked around the nurse's station and walked out. And they started freaking out. Like, how did these guys get on this locked unit? And Betty was being transferred to Western Psych in the morning. Western Psych is a mental hospital in Pittsburgh. So they didn't know what else to do with her. So my mom went in because you have to go in and check the patient. And Betty said to my mom, they're outside the window. They're up about like 8-10 floors. My mom's like, nobody's outside the window. I'll go look. She pulls open the curtain. There was a guy right outside the window. And my mom was like, she said, I remember looking dead at him and then closing the curtains and like, nope, no, I'm not doing this either. And she had the orderly, because he had holy water with him. He doused the room and Betty just screamed. She said, it was the worst screaming. So, they made it through the morning. They were getting her out and she was settled. She was just panicking. And they got her downstairs and they said, well, someone has to ride with her from the hospital to do the paperwork. Mom was like, I guess I'll go. Because they had her pumped full of drugs and everything. And she said to the ambulance guy, she's like, when we get in, you're going to hit the sirens and you're just going to go. I don't care if it's the Parkway. We're going to make room and go. And my mom said she got in. And when she got in, she said she turned her head and there were 2 guys on the one corner. And they kind of moved apart. And the guy that was at Helen's funeral came and stood in between them. And he waved at her. And my mom said, she looked at the paramedic and she's like, you're going to lock this door. We're going now. And the guy was like, she's unconscious. She's not going to hurt us. She's like, I'm not worried about her. So they start going. They have the sirens going and everything. Suddenly the doors start flying open on the Parkway. And my mom is like, I told you we need to go. So like they're holding the doors. They get to Western Psych. The ambulance crew's like, we had enough. We had enough of this. She's your problem now. You signed the paperwork. We're done. And my mom was like, that was the last time that Betty had walked into the hospital. I don't want to name the hospital because it's no longer with us, the hospital. But then a few years later, when my parents got engaged, where my mom worked, she saw this really old woman. And she walked past her, and my mom said, because my mom remembered everyone, she stopped and she's like, I know you. She's like, Betty. And she said it did look like Betty had aged almost 100 years. And so like Betty didn't recognize her. Betty didn't know who my mom was. And, my mom, she felt awful. And so my dad had proposed to her that day. So she got, she went down, she got in the car. She said she had yellow roses from him and everything. They got in the car. He went to pull out. Betty jumped out the window and landed on his car. She had committed suicide and landed on his car. Yeah. Yeah.
My gosh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
I don't need to watch it. I don't need to watch a horror movie this season now. I just heard one. That is some of the craziest stuff I've ever heard.
Yeah.
All right, that's enough, folks. Good night. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Goodness gracious.
Yeah, it was, I mean, you could tell when she told it, she was just so uncomfortable, and it affected her so bad. Like she felt so bad for her that, like, she said it couldn't have been more than 6 months since she had seen her, and she looked like she had aged 100 years.
Yeah, that's rough.
And then to do
Wow.
that, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
That's, it makes me wonder how much possessions and mental issues could be crossed over. Like how many times has a possession been, somebody's got a mental disorder, or the other way around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like I said, they didn't know what to do with her, so they shipped her off to a psychiatric hospital.
That's
Right.
unbelievable.
I mean,
I've heard similar stories. That's that's close to home. That's pretty bad.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
I think
When she speaks in tongues, that's an indicator, I think, that there's something else going on. I mean, how does a crazy person know a foreign language they've never learned? You had mentioned that, something about speaking in tongues. So I think that's a sign that it's something else.
Right. And I can guarantee you, knowing where my mom worked, knowing the area, that wasn't being taught then to anybody. They, like any school, even if it was a Catholic school, they had phased that out,
Wow.
And because my mom learned some Latin when she went to Catholic school, and she said she didn't even understand what she was saying, and
That must have been terrifying to be in the room.
Yeah, I could imagine. I could only imagine. And she said that it was one of the worst days. It was one of the worst days. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I can't think it would get much worse than that. To Vincent's point as well, I do think that it's sometimes difficult to determine genuine possession from mental illness. And I'm sure there are people in insane asylums who have other spiritual problems, and there are probably people walking around that, that think they're just spiritually gifted or something, and are mentally troubled. But I have a good friend who's an exorcist, or was an exorcist. He's not anymore. Ed Schultz is his name. He used to be an exorcist for the Warrens, Ed and Lorraine Warren, amongst other things. He used to be known as the psychic priest, and he talks about how he was very careful when he would do exorcisms. Like, he would do tests to try to ensure that it wasn't just a mental illness. And in fact, he's writing a book now. I can't wait to read his memoirs, because I think he goes through a lot of that in the book, the difficulty sometimes, and how careful you had to be trying to determine if it was just a psychiatric disorder or whether somebody had been, taken over by something which was from the other side or which wasn't human.
Right.
Well, Dean, I have a question for you then, for everyone really to consider. Do you think perhaps that it could, in perhaps even many instances, be both, in the sense that when someone is vulnerable, they maybe already have mental issues and they are targeted by something that was never human, and that they then become possessed because they are fragile and because they're already vulnerable people? Do you think that could be a possibility, that it's actually both?
Yeah, I think in some cases that would definitely be. In fact, it's hard to imagine somebody who is very spiritually centered and very psychologically stable to have the type of problem one way or the other, be it a possession or a mental, a mental problem. So I could imagine that somebody who is weak would be susceptible both to a psychic collapse as well as to something from outside taking advantage of them. I think you're dead on, Sam. I bet you that's the case a lot of the time.
I also wonder whether, if someone is more inclined to, and I hate to use the word belief, but when someone is particularly a practicing Christian, or someone who has a deep-rooted faith that's incredibly strong in their family and their upbringing, are they also perhaps more likely to be targeted because they're in that world of understanding and that realm of that species of attack? Whereas if an atheist or someone who's not even familiar with it may not be Does it, in fact, perhaps attract possession by dabbling it? You know, people always say, you know, you shouldn't mess with a Ouija board, even though it was a Victorian parlor game. It's still a gateway, and when you invite something, it's the intention. So perhaps to be fearful of demons might, in fact, attract them.
Yeah, that's probably a double-edged sword, because sometimes it might attract them, but sometimes also there might be a level of protection for people with a strong faith in whatever the tradition is. There might be an idea that there are barriers up that stop the evil from coming in. Maybe it's the person in the middle. Maybe it's the person who's the lapsed, I mean, I'm not a Catholic, but maybe it's the person who's the lapsed Catholic who isn't practicing anymore, but is cognizant of demonic, you know, possession, who might be more susceptible because they themselves then either they don't have that protection anymore, or they don't believe they have the protection anymore, if we want to look at it psychologically. So I think you're onto something. I think there's probably something to it. It's the same in Australia. They used to talk about I guess the equivalent of shaman, the type of the wise men or the medicine men types of Aboriginal people would do something called point the bone, and that would essentially be a way you would kill somebody with a psychic, you know, bad mojo projection. But it never worked on you know, white colonists, because they didn't believe. So but it would work often on people who were in that belief system. So yeah, you have to sometimes ask too, how much is that psychological position of the person? How much does it put them in harm's way? Yeah. So it's certainly a good question.
If I might add, I think there's a couple of factors that might make someone more susceptible to possession. And I mean, I'm not an expert, but this is just the stuff that I'm hearing and seeing from people. They say that the devil is tempted by someone who shows to be naive and shows to be vulnerable and very open and receptive to these kind of dark things, even in displaying an inordinate interest. Like tonight, we're all, you know, we have listeners who are obviously listening, you know, for the purpose of hearing about these strange things. We ourselves are interested in these types of topics, and that in itself attracts certain negative energies to us. You know, and then some of us, of course, are probably more, I'm not saying we are, but maybe some are more vulnerable to those intrusions. You know, someone who is seen as maybe displaying a desire to work within the dark arts, or maybe dabble in what you were talking about, the Ouija board, might be inviting something in. And maybe they see this person as being weaker than others and easier to possess or take over. So that's just my opinion. I think that sometimes people tend to show too much interest in the negative entities, and that in itself draws their attention.
Yeah, I think
And
that's
I agree
accurate.
with that. Go ahead.
No,
Yeah,
John,
Sam, you're on
Sorry.
mute, Sam.
Oh. John Keel made the point that Albert K. Bender, the first person who had the classic Men in Black experience, he was the person who shut down an early flying saucer investigation type of club when he was visited by these three men in black. And as the legend is, you know, or he later said they were extraterrestrials or whatever else. But Keel made the point of saying that Bender was very much involved in the occult, and, you know, he was into, you know, the paranormal in a big way as well. And in fact, Keel would say something very similar. He would say that the way, if you're being haunted by these type of things, be it extraterrestrial intrusions, or be it demonic manifestations, or be it poltergeist activity, you should burn all of your books on UFOs, burn all your books on the paranormal, stop thinking about it altogether. So I think Anna's point, that's exactly true. I think people can open themselves, particularly people who are already susceptible to this kind of stuff, when you have an interest in it. It's like, you know, the old saying, if you stare long enough into the abyss, the Nietzsche quote, the abyss stares back. Now, of course, Nietzsche didn't mean that literally, but I think we can literalize it to a degree in the paranormal. I think if you're looking into this stuff all the time, it can get your attention, you know. It can can notice that you noticed it.
I think it takes a toll on some of the investigators and researchers. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think, as I was going to say before I foolishly muted myself, you know, if you grab a tiger by the tail, there's only going to be so many results.
That's true. Yeah.
You know, unless it's a stuffed toy or, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
But no, I agree with you, Anna. In my case with my grandmother, she embraced it because I'm assuming there were things promised, and I don't know if she ever got anything.
What was
but
in that book?
she
Man, I tell you.
oh my god, it was just, she always complained that was her book, that was promised to her, you know, that was supposed to be hers. And it's just, in her case, she wanted to be able to do what my mother was able to do what I was able to do, and then some, you know. That's, I think, what she wanted, and somehow she got lured in. And yeah, so I agree, you know, she's the type who embraced it.
I think that's a big part of it as well, as embracing it. Again, you can only poo-poo it and woo-woo it so much. Things start to happen, and I think it piques a lot of people's interests, and sometimes they go down the avenue of expectance, and they're not really entirely sure what they're going to get, but they go too far anyway. I get the chills with those kind of things for sure.
All right, I've got a question for the panel. Have either of any of you guys ever had a ghost, either sighting or experience of some sort? Why don't you start, Anna?
I've had quite a few.
Could you tell us about one?
You mean me?
Yes, please.
Yes. Well, I don't know if many people know, I was born and raised in the Philippines, and I actually grew up in a house that ended up being the graveyard, an unofficial graveyard for Japanese soldiers. It wasn't until much later when they unearthed the fact that the backyard had a lot of bones. And there were relics of, you know, uniforms and things of that nature, medals that were buried in there, parts of skeletons and things of that nature. The entire development that we found ourselves in, that my grandparents bought, they built houses hastily right after World War II without looking at what was in the soil. So it was replete with hauntings. There was a lot of stuff that was showing itself. As soon as twilight hit, you would go in the backyard. You don't want to be there, but you know, a lot of people didn't know this. You would see a man who was sitting right on the ground. He had his legs folded up, and he looked like he was wearing tattered clothing, and he looked like he starved to death, or he was starving to death. And his eyes are furious. He looks at you, right at you, with red eyes, full of rage. That was just one of many sightings. We've had ones where the open window, if you're standing right next to it, you know, or you're in the bathroom on the second floor. I remember this, an uncle went up to bed around 12 o'clock midnight, was brushing his teeth, and he distinctly felt the breath of someone by his ear. There was one where there was a servant that my family had hired, and she was feeding the cats in the backyard. Animals were not fed inside the house, not like here, you know, you give the dogs their food inside. Animals were fed inside the house, and usually they were fed in the backyard. And as she proceeded down there, there was a man who was just standing there, looked like he had, you know, your proverbial horns in his head, but he had a face that resembled something like a cow with huge pupils, the eyes of a cat. Who knows what that was? But there was just a sense of menace, a sense of evil. People who have visited never came back. People are very reluctant to stay overnight. This was a pretty big house, so we had guest rooms and everything, and people had difficulty after dinner staying. They say they hear voices when they go to the bathroom. They say they feel like they're being followed when they're walking down the hallway. There was just a lot of activity.
Is there any cultural
Wow.
tradition there of something with that strange looking animalistic face, or any demon or
I was told
mythology? Or...
a number of stories. We also have the version of the elementals, something called a capre, who lives to protect the trees and is usually found folded within the trees. And it does have these horns, and it's about the size of a man. But there's also the other version where because it's a very old country, there's a lot of deep forest where things have never been seen, some places that are not charted yet. But even the most busiest suburban areas have all kinds of manifestations, even on the road at night. It tends to be a very dark country. I mean, people say it's overpopulated, but you go into a given neighborhood, there's no lighting in the streets. So who knows what you're going to stumble into?
Yeah, that's absolutely terrifying. It reminds me of a friend of mine that I went to university in England, and we had a number of foreign students that had joined our course from various parts of the world, and one of them was a chap named Joe Giacano Jr., and he was from Borneo, and he told me that his father would always tell him and his friends to never go into the forests or the jungle at night, because it was haunted and it had all kinds of spirits and demons that would eat you and that kind of thing. And most people sort of brushed it off as, okay, well, the jungle's just dangerous and treacherous anyway. There are wild animals, there are cats and things that might take you away, even big snakes perhaps. So they didn't really pay much attention to it. And yet they were always told to be home before the sun goes down, so they didn't worry their parents. And so they took the Jeep one night and they went to the next town to sort of find a place to drink. And they lived in the middle of nowhere kind of thing. And then they drove back and they thought, oh God, the sun's going down. And before they knew it, they were driving through the dirt road to get back to their village. And it was nighttime. And as you say, there was no lights. It was pitch black. And then they saw a figure at the side of the road ahead of them in the beams of their Jeep. And it was a woman wearing a white dress, just stood with her arms outstretched towards the vehicle, stood at the side of the road. And she didn't have a head. And she was stood there. And so they approached really slowly, and his friend said, no, keep going. And they heard screaming. And they were looking around everywhere, and then all of a sudden one of their friends says, oh my God, look up. So they looked up out the Jeep, and her head was floating maybe 50 feet above them, screaming down at them. And so they just tore off and got back to the village. And he says to this day he doesn't know what it was, but it absolutely happened.
Good grief.
Terrifying.
I believe there's a cryptid that's maybe even in the Philippines. Anna, maybe you can help me with this. That separates their top part from the bottom part, and the top part flies around and screams. And
there is. It's I'm trying to remember what it is called. I see the picture in my head. It's a female, and apparently it's vampiric in nature. And the reason why it haunts that way is that it's trying to encourage people to put the head back together with the body, from what I understand. It's a very strange type of, I don't know where the story came from. This was something that was circulating for a while, as a matter of fact, on the internet. And there's several kinds of hauntings involving this woman. So, Sam, what you're talking about, that has a lot of commonality with something I had heard of before. It's at the tip of my tongue. I'm trying to remember what it's called. But we have something very similar there, where there's a bride, and apparently the bride got run over by a car on her evening before her wedding. She was carrying her bridal dress. And it was a taxi driver that hit her. So now the story goes, and it's called The Legend of Baliti Drive. Taxi driver is going down this road, and he's got his last fare with him. He drops the man off, and now he's alone, and he decides, because it's so late, that he's going to take a shortcut. So, of course, he takes this shortcut through the wooded area, which happens to span Baliti Drive. Baliti Drive is an actual road in Manila. It is probably, I would say, maybe 50 miles outside the metropolitan area, which means it's pretty dark at night. It quickly becomes very dark once you leave the city. You're in pitch dark. You're just relying on lines on the road. So he's driving on here, and there's no one else. And then in the distance, there's a woman who's wearing a gown, and she's waving. And of course, he decides, I think it might have been like 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, as the legend goes, at 2 o'clock in the morning. He stops the car just because he doesn't want to leave her to walk, and opens the door, lets her in, and wants to know where she's going. And she doesn't say a word. So he keeps glancing at the rear view mirror, and suddenly she's gone. And then he turns around, and it's a skull. He sees a skull where the head was.
Wow. Manananggal.
And is that what it is?
Manananggal.
That looks familiar too. And what happens is he drives away, and he never sees her again until the next taxi driver comes along and has the same exact experience around the same time in the early morning hours.
It's interesting. There's a predominance of a very similar story to that cross-culturally. Like, there are many stories in America, and I know there are in the UK, I believe, and also I think in Australia and probably all around the world, where often brides who died or other women who died in tragic circumstances, normally younger women, are picked up as hitchhikers along the road, or are picked up by cab drivers, or are picked up for one reason or another because they're in the middle of nowhere and they look lost, or the driver feels, bad for them, or they hail even the car down. And sure enough, they get into the car and then they disappear. There's a number of them in America. And for example, they'll be taking a woman to an address she's given them. And when they get there, the house that was once there where they were taking her is burnt down, and they'll look in the back and she's not there. Or they'll go to the address. This is another very common one. And some of these are probably, urban legends, but some of them are based, I think, on actual experiences where the woman disappears in the car when they're driving her to the address, and then they go and knock on the door where they go, and it's answered by somebody who says, "Oh, yes, she used to live here," often the parents or sometimes a relative or somebody later. They know that sounds like, old Mary Sue who died back in 1952 on that bridge. So it's interesting that these things, these experiences and these tales seem to be, much like the fair folk, as Mr. Sam Sheeran was saying before, tend to be cross-culturally ubiquitous. They seem to appear all around the world. And there are many tales like that they resonate at some archetypal level. Whatever the reality of them or not the reality, they're a part of us. They're a part of the way we tell stories and the way we dream of the way we imagine the afterlife and these people coming back to visit us, these lost souls, which is obviously also particularly significant at Halloween, because Halloween's, one of the other things, as well as the Fae, it's the lost souls who look in, on Halloween nights. And some people set tables for the dead on Halloween. There are traditions that like to keep the dead away, and so you might put the jack-o'-lantern in the window to scare them away, but there are other cultures that actually open the door and set the table, and the light in the window isn't to scare the dead away, but is to welcome the dead in so they can find them when they're traveling, in this world, and they can come in and eat and spend a night in the land of the living again. So, I'm always very cognizant of both the fair folk and those tales of the dead on Halloween. I like to remember the old meaning of the holiday, the old meaning of the season.
Wow. Do you think that the veil gets thinner towards Halloween? Do you think it's easier for these things to come through on Halloween?
I think that's what's believed. I mean, traditionally that's been the idea, and it makes sense it makes more sense to me now, because I'm obviously from Australia, and October in Australia is when it's getting warmer. And Sydney, unlike where I live in America, sure, it gets a little bit colder, but a brutal winter day is like a spring day here or a fall day here in Sydney. I mean, we never get down to ridiculous temperatures, or we never did. But when I moved here, I became very conscious of that seasonal difference. Like here, when the days get so much shorter, and I have a garden, and you've got to have been harvested by then. And there was one year I didn't have a big enough chicken shed or a chicken coop. I had to build a bigger coop because there wasn't room for my chickens before the cold weather got here, because they knew they wouldn't make it. And people here hunt during gun season around this time of year to bring their venison in that they're going to bring in for the winter. So it's not like it once was, but there's the idea that you're going into darker days. And now, of course, we have the benefits of electricity and the internet, and we can be in our warm house, and we can get in our car, and we can drive to our cubicle at work, and we're not really cold for most of it, certainly not city people. But in the olden days, you can see when the days got much shorter and the nights got much longer, and you were often frightened to go out at night. And if you hadn't put enough food aside, it could really be the end of you or your family. That you can imagine how that other world seems so much closer. So I think some of it's culturally bound, but I do think there's where there's smoke, there's fire with these kind of legends. I think people probably did have more experiences. And I think some people probably still do. But again, in our bright electricity lit world today, it's not scary to go out so much on Halloween night as it was if you were, an Irish peasant 200 years ago.
Do you think maybe also the belief in it, the belief that the veil is the thinnest, like a collective belief, makes it the thinnest than any other time of the year?
Yeah, possibly. I think our expectations. Greg Bishop, who writes mainly in the realm of ufology, but he has something called co-creation theory when it applies to UFOs. And he thinks that we're interacting with the phenomenon to have it present to us the way that we kind of culturally expect. It doesn't mean there isn't an exterior phenomenon, but our beliefs interconnect with it. And yes, I certainly think if there's a broad cultural tradition that these things are going to be more apparent at a specific time or a specific date, then yeah, I have no doubt. That's a very good question, Bernadette, and I think that's very telling. I do think it probably impacts what we see and what we experience, those expectations.
I wanted to add too, Dean, I don't know what you think of this, but the equinoxes, the autumn equinox came about, and then we also have the Druid rites that happen in Stonehenge and things of that nature. I think there's some kind of planetary alignment, not just the seasons, but having to do with the alignment of the planets that cause these energies maybe to thin the veil. I don't know much about it to really speak about it, but I do know I used to attend these equinoxes. We had a holistic lady here who used to dabble in natural medicine, and she would hold them 4 times a year. And she explained that it was very certain medicines for healing were much more effective on certain equinox days. So that if you ingested something on an equinox, it had a different effect on your body than others. So talking about the veil being thinner around this time for these types of energies, I think there might be some case for that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if it applies to the solstices as well, because I know there, for example, the Shakespeare play Midsummer Night's Dream, when those kind of entities are more active, that falls upon the solstice or close to the solstice, right? So I wonder if these cultures did understand something about those changes. For example, in Ireland, it was all of the quarter days, which were dangerous to go out. So it was Halloween, and it was Beltane, and it was all of the other two as well. I always forget the Gaelic terms for them. But yeah, there does seem to be those periods. And whether it is because of, if there is some astrological significance, or whether it is, like Bernadette said, that people have that expectation, or whether it is somehow, which I like the most because it's charmingly more literal, if it really is when the fair folk are moving between, between their residences. They're actually, we're moving from here to here, and you better not get in our way. But for whatever reason, those things certainly used to ring very true. And we've lost a lot of that now because, again, even if you live somewhere which gets brutally cold, like where I live, we're still so protected by electricity and by, petroleum engines and by big supplies of food and by a convenience store, which is only, depending where you live, for me, it's like 40 minutes away, but most people it's closer than that. Still, we can go and get something. If we haven't got all the food in by the end of the harvest season, we're not probably going to starve to death in today's world. But I think we used to be very conscious of those seasons, the same way that we would want to make sure that we were planted by a certain time in the spring. There was a real consciousness of how the seasons impacted life. And during the winter, for the most part, it was a peaceful time. If you were well stocked up, you didn't do very much in the old land in the winter because you'd done all your harvesting. You'd brought everything in. It was a waiting time. It was a time for stories on long, dark nights around fireplaces. So all of this type of legend could emerge. Well, today, I think we're poorer culturally, which I guess is what I'm pointing at. I think that we've become so disconnected. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I want to go and live where, if I don't have my potato harvest in by October, I'm going to starve, right? But we've lost something culturally. We've lost a connection to the way the world works and our role in it. And I think as a result of that, I think we've lost a lot of the fascinating mythology that used to be connected with it. It's why now Halloween's just trick-or-treating and watching horror movie marathons and getting drunk at a party if you're in college or something. While back then it had a real significance, whether it was the old Roman harvest festival, which kind of combined with those Druidic traditions and the idea of Samhain and the idea of the Lord of the Dead and the idea that, it was the end of the season of the sun and now we were going into the winter. For whatever reason, we really connected seasonally. It wasn't just a date. The date actually represented a massive change in how our lifestyle would be affected by the success of a crop or by the length of the winter. And today we don't have that connection anymore. It's gone. And as a result, and mythologically, we're poorer for it, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I really do. So back to Vincent's question, though. Have you guys seen any ghosts, Dean, Mr. Sam?
Too many.
Too many.
I think we attract them. Yeah,
I understand that.
Yeah, I was just abducted there for a second. For some strange, spooky reason, the internet just went out. So I have.
It's okay. It's a spooky day.
Yeah, it never happens as well. So that's kind of.
We shouldn't have been talking about the she. That's what they used to say. You shouldn't talk about them.
Yeah, they pulled the wire.
I got a very intriguing thing to add before Sam begins. Sam, I tell you this is true. Every time I used to come on, and I've been on Lon's show maybe 3 or 4 times. And the first couple of times I was talking about the demonic infestation that was in my family's house. Every time I mentioned that evil, for some reason, the internet would cut out. The picture would go or the sound would go. And it got to the point where it was like, there's something here that's preventing me from telling this entire story. But do go on. I'm sorry.
What's that behind you?
Right.
That's why I'm well lighted.
Nah, right. That's why you see me.
Look at Vince.
Were you going to tell a ghost story, though, Sam? One of yours?
Oh, sure. I mean, this is an old one, but it's true. And I think that I have to start by saying that it's 100% real. And this took place when I was 7 years old in England, where I grew up, where I was born and raised. And me and my mum used to live in a town called Runcorn in Cheshire, in the northwest of England. And we were on the edge of a big forest, strangely enough. And it was wonderful because of a day you would walk around and you'd go to the ponds and look at the, you know, the little swampy areas, and there was a stagnant pond there, which, by the way, after several years of being told to never go near it because it was almost like quicksand. It was covered in duckweed and you couldn't really see where the edge was, and it was dangerous. They drained it one year and they found hundreds of skeletons of animals, pets, all kinds of things. So it was literally a rotting bog of corpses. But that's not where the story starts. My aunt and uncle had visited, and I hadn't seen them in a while. And my uncle had gifted me a book on dinosaurs, which I was obsessed with. Still love them. And so it got to around 10 o'clock at night. And again, I was 7 years old. So 10 o'clock at night was pretty late to be staying up for me anyway, in my family. I would normally have been in bed by then. But I was so happy with this dinosaur book and seeing my aunt and uncle, I was wide awake. And nevertheless, I was sent to bed at 10 o'clock. And it was, you know, that's it. Up the apples and pears. Time to go to bed. So I went to bed. It's a small house. So you could hear people downstairs. You could hear the television. It was pretty much next to you in a sense. And so I had real trouble trying to go to sleep. I wanted to be downstairs because I could hear clinking of glasses, laughter, and the television, you know. And so I'm sort of sitting up in bed and I'm turning over and I'm turning back. And it sort of dies down. And my aunt and uncle had come to say goodnight, and they stood in the doorway. And I was really happy because I wasn't going to see them. They were leaving early the next day. So I was glad that we were saying goodnight. So I sat up and sort of said, you know, thanks for the dinosaur book. It was great to see you. I hope to see you soon. You know, sleep well. I won't see you in the morning. Bye. And they didn't answer me. And they just stood there. And of course, I'm a kid and I'm a little afraid of the dark at that point. Still am in a way. And I have the hall light on, the landing light. And the hall light's on sort of floods my doorway. So they're stood there in silhouette. And I can't really make them out. But then I rub my eyes and I look again to sort of say good night. And they still don't answer me. They're just standing there. And that's when they start to walk into the room, but not towards me, almost diagonally away from me and across from me, past me in a sense. And that's when I realized they were a lot shorter than they should have been. And it was a little boy and a little girl wearing frilly clothes. And so immediately I screamed the walls down. I throw my pillow across the room and I don't want to look. And I look up. It's the only place I can go. I look up. Don't want to close my eyes because I still want to know what's going on. In defense, I just look away and I look up. And that's where it gets really weird. There's a green fireball the size of a soccer ball or a football. And it's traveling around the four corners of my ceiling. And this green fireball, when I look up, it comes down at me. Almost as if to say, you know, look, don't look up here, look at them. And it's as though it's forcing me to look because I try and sort of cower away from this green fireball. And I look again and I'm screaming. And this is all happening in seconds, at which point my mum runs into the room and she grabs my arm, pulls me out of the room, shuts the bedroom door, and we run downstairs. And it's funny because she told me at the time I was having a bad dream, and I knew very well I wasn't. And she said the next day, I don't know what happened last night. I just know that there was something going on in your room I didn't understand, and I had to get you out of there. But we won't talk about this again. And that was it. So she saw something too.
Have you talked about it since, like as an adult? Did you later ask her about it?
Yeah, I brought it up when I was 9, and I was sort of it was nipped in the bud very quickly. We don't talk about that. And then later in life, I've asked her, and she's explained to me that she won't talk about it because it terrifies her. And she's almost blocked it out. And she kind of does the la 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 thing. And she just doesn't want to talk about it because she's genuinely scared. She just remains with the same line. I knew something was going on in your room. I didn't understand, and I just had to get you out of there. And that was it. And we moved house shortly after. That's the other funny thing.
I bet they did move. Huh? Wow.
But, yeah, we all slept downstairs that night.
Wow.
All of us. Oh, and incidentally, the little town in Runcorn, the town itself was called Murdershaw.
Goodness gracious.
Spelled differently, but legend has it, or history has it, in fact, legendary history. Many hundreds of years ago, people used to be hung from the trees in the forest because it was cheaper than making the gallows, because there were so many people who were being hung. They said, we'll make this the capital so that no one gets away. And that became the place to go and be hung and or hanged. And yeah, so there is a history there, and it was called Murdershaw. They laid all the bodies out, and it looked like a shoreline.
But other than that, a pretty friendly place, right?
But it was really nice. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it was lovely, you know, trees, hedgehogs, yeah.
That's not the only time I've heard the description of a green, like soccer ball sized fireball.
Well,
and that's intriguing.
I've looked since for stories similar, and I've yet to I keep toying with myself, should I create some artwork to recreate what I saw, you know, do a scene, a piece of artwork based on it. And I'm not sure if I want to, but I've looked for similar stories, and I have a huge collection of unexplained books, and over the years I found very few, but there are one or two cases of green glowing children, not with a fireball though, and there are other cases of green fireballs, but more in line with meteors or UFOs that have been seen in the sky, certainly not flying around someone's bedroom.
Right.
And I was absolutely awake. Yeah.
Wow. Well, your mom said she saw something. So. Well,
that's the thing, and to this day, I'm begging her, "What did you see?" You know, and she says she just didn't understand it. It didn't make any sense.
It's that adult witness that makes that so fascinating, because children, whether we want to think they actually can see through the veil or whether they just have a more vivid imagination, often have these type of experiences. I know last time I was on Phantoms and Monsters, so I won't talk about it again tonight, I talked about an ongoing bedroom visitation come dream I had as a child. And because it was just me who experienced it, I'm always like, well, was it a dream? Or, what was it? But the fact that your mother came in and was so bothered by what she saw indicates that there was more to your experience than an overactive imagination of a child, or just a child having more connection with the other. There was something manifesting in your room that went beyond just childhood connection.
Yeah. I mean, she went on to say that my description of the children wearing frilly clothes like knickerbockers and stuff, she's argued the point that I couldn't have known what they would be wearing, or where did that come from, kind of thing. I would say, to play devil's advocate, maybe I saw something on television, you could explain that, but at the same time it was just so randomly vivid to me, and they didn't say anything, they didn't do anything, they didn't attack me, they didn't run at me, they simply walked diagonally across the room in front of me, and it was horrific because there was no reason for it. It was almost as though it was none of my business. And it was just happening. It was horrible.
So, Sam, that sounds like almost like a residual haunting, that it wasn't planned for you to see it, but you were sensitive enough to see it. And apparently your mother had the same experience, which is why she found it inexplicable. She was too terrified to repeat to you. She didn't want to collaborate with you what you had experienced. And I'm just thinking that maybe, as a mother, I wouldn't want to say to my son, I saw it too, and this is how it looked, because it might even lead you to have more nightmares.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Initially, it was, oh, you just had a bad dream, but then afterwards, it was, we're not going to talk about this. So I knew she had seen something, and she admitted she has, but won't talk about it. So yeah, very, very weird stuff. But it was a weird place as well. Strange things would always happen in that house. Everything from just random things that you could explain away, like a pipe bursting under the sink with an incredible noise flooding the entire room with the kitchen with water instantly, that kind of thing. Those can be explained. As terrifying as that was, it was like a scene from Poltergeist, But and my mom scooped me up and ran outside, and it was just terrifying. That kind of stuff happened a lot. But there was one other instance, just real quick, where, and this happened in the daytime. I have a book. I still have this book to this day. I recently found it in my parents' attic. And it's a book on Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales, funnily enough. And as a child, at the same age, around 6 or 7 years old, I had a big old wooden chest of drawers in the bedroom. And there was a gap under it, maybe 4 inches high. And I always used to get a horrible feeling about this cabinet and underneath it. And I didn't even want to go near it at times. It felt foreboding, and I didn't like this chest of drawers. And one day I'm stood sort of, a few feet from it, and I'm reading this Hans Christian Andersen book that I've just got. And it was illustrated. So there's lovely images inside of the Snow Queen and, Mother Goose, all that kind of stuff. And I'm flicking through the images, and I'm reading some of the sort of intros to some of the stories. And I go to the front of the book, and there's an oval portrait in color, a painting of Hans Christian Andersen. And he's sat under a tree with a pen and a book. And he's surrounded by fairies and toadstools and things. And he's gently looking towards you, in a sense. And he's smiling, almost like a Mona Lisa smile, not a grin. He's just comfortably smirking in a way. And I look at it, and I said to the book, I said to him, "Oh, you're quite clever, aren't you?" And he nodded. In the book, he nodded. And I threw this book across the floor, and it slid under that cabinet. And I did not retrieve it for years.
How old were you when he nodded?
I was 6 or 7.
Do you think that had an impact on you wanting to become an artist of the macabre?
Possibly, yeah. I've never seen a picture move since, but he absolutely nodded. And it was a gentle sort of, yes, I am kind of thing. It was horrible.
Wow.
Yeah. I can imagine it that, yeah.
I mean,
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, when I was 7, I don't know, maybe 8 years old, I think. 8 years old. My grandfather, who I was very close with, at my birthday party, announced to everyone that he was sick and he was going to pass away soon. Now, he kept this a secret for, all the way up until the end. He died very shortly after, I want to say like a month or so. Now, we couldn't make it to the hospital when he passed. But that night, I was woken up, and so were my parents in a different room. We could hear my grandfather downstairs on the rocking chair saying, my father and I have the same name, St. Vince. And we all three heard him. And all three of us were too scared to go downstairs. But yeah, we all heard it. His grandpa coming to say bye.
Wow.
And that was one of the first real solid paranormal ghost things that happened to me personally.
What about you, Dean?
I don't have anything quite as dramatic as Sam's story, or quite as visual, perhaps I should say, either of those. Although I did tell you, like I said last time I was here, my little man story. I certainly had other bedroom visitations when I was younger. And I tend to think of those, even though they fit occult patterns, as probably being sleep paralysis. Like a big black dog used to walk into my room at night when the lights were out and sit there and stare at me, and I was frozen. and I couldn't move. But that's easy to
My
explain.
God, that's terrifying.
It is
Oh my
terrifying,
God.
and the memory still makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. But it still fits the sleep paralysis pattern, you know. There were other paranormal experiences in my childhood home, and I never saw anything other than those things when I was in bed. So again, is that sleep paralysis or something else? But I do remember clearly being home one day from school. Both my brother and I were sick, and my parents were both in fact, it might have been post my parents' divorce. So maybe my mother was just working when we were home alone. Anyway, it was I would have been around 11-ish, I think. And I remember us hearing very clearly, because the house wasn't massive. It was just a ranch type design house. I remember very clearly me and my brother being terrified because there was something walking around our house. Like, there was no doubt there was something walking around our house, and the doors were locked. There was nothing coming in. There were other experiences like that when I was little, and we used to also foolishly perhaps fool around with things like Ouija boards and other, you know, paranormal things in our pre-teens to early teen years. But the most fascinating, and this is just weird, and I often wonder how much of it explains, is when I was a little boy, I remember very clearly, and it's something my mother has confirmed, so it wasn't me imagining it. We had a handyman. That was when my father and mother were still married, and my father was often away on business internationally. It's what he did. He also was, I think he was still in the Navy Reserve, so I believe he was like a lieutenant commander in the reserve, so he was often away doing Navy stuff as well. Well, he was away a lot anyway, so we had a handyman to do a lot of those things that, you know, a father would normally do. It wasn't that my father wasn't handy. In fact, he was an aircraft engineer. He was very handy, but he often wasn't there. And I remember the handyman was supposedly a psychic. And I remember he shouldn't have probably said it in earshot of me, because you don't want to hear this when you're a little boy. So he was allegedly a psychic. And I remember him explaining to my mother that there was a body buried under our house. He was sure of it. The thing was still here. So I think that probably was formative when I was small for a lot of my probably fear of the paranormal, and on perhaps a totally unrelated sense, because it could have just been a figment of my imagination, but something my mother remembers too. There were a couple of tiles in our bathroom which had increasingly human-looking faces develop on those tiles. Now, was that pareidolia? Perhaps, you know, or was it there's something buried under the house that the psychic handyman had been so convinced was down below? I don't know. But that's probably as closest to any type of ghost story that I have to share with you guys.
Yeah.
That's pretty creepy. Speaking of faces appearing, just a real quick one. My grandmother passed away a couple of years ago, and hours later, I was in the kitchen with my mum, you know, and we had spilt a little coffee on the side. And we were just talking, and I turned around and we looked at this little puddle of coffee, and I've got a photograph of it. And it was literally a portrait of my grandmother. It looked like her face smiling, and we both burst into tears. And it was as though she was saying, "I'm okay.
Wow.
I made it," you know?
That's beautiful. That's wonderful. Wow.
Very strange. It's not something we would look for or particularly believe in, that kind of thing, but it was uncanny. And me and my mum looked at each other and we were like, wow, she's okay.
Wow. That's just great. I love that. Wow.
So I have one. I have a lot, but I have one. So my mom's stepsister died. They were very close, and she died on my mom's birthday. And we went to the funeral. It was like the first time I had ever been to a funeral and everything. I was still little, and afterwards, you know, we stayed because we knew the funeral home and everything. And next day, apparently, like, my uncle wanted to. The building that my mom's sister had lived in was a family building. Like, my mom had lived in there. My grandfather was there. My grandmother. It was someplace they knew. So I had never been there. So we went in, and my mom looked at me. She turned around. She's like, "Don't you touch anything. Don't touch anything. Don't climb on anything. You know, just stay right here. I don't listen very well. So her and my uncle, they went off towards the kitchen. They were talking, and I went off towards this room. Like there was like a little bedroom, and there was a fireplace and a step stool and a bed and everything, and there was knickknacks up on the fireplace. I'm like, I'm gonna just climb up and touch everything and play with everything. So I'm like playing with everything, and you know how you get the sense when someone's watching you. I looked and there was nobody, and I kept playing, kept getting that. I looked right up and there was this woman. She was like staring at me. I'm thinking, I'm in trouble. Like I'm not supposed to be touched. I don't know who she is, but I'm gonna get, you know, in a lot of trouble. She had her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She had glasses, and she kind of smiled at me, and I'm like, you know, and then I turned around, she wasn't there. Turned back, she is still there looking at me. I screamed so loud, and I dropped the stuff. I ran out the door. I got into the car, locked the door, locked my mom out of the car, and I'm like curled in the back seat, like I am freaking out so bad. So like they're trying to get the car door open. You know, they're trying to get me to open the car door. I won't open the car door. Behind them are two guys, two movers moving stuff out. And I remember one was heavy set and he had white overalls, and the other guy was not heavy set, but kind of stocky, kind of in the middle. And he said something to the guy who was heavy set, and the guy who was heavy set looked at him and said, "Don't you dare, the kid's been traumatized enough." And I looked at him, he looked at me, and he just smiled, and that was it. When I told my mom that later, she said there was nobody moving anything. It was just the three of us there. And I said, no, but they were loading stuff into a pickup truck. The pickup truck was behind your car. She's like, there was no pickup truck. And I come to find out that the woman in the mirror was my great-grandmother.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah. Because we were looking at like old photo albums, and I stopped. I'm like, that was her. That was who was in the mirror. And my grandmother, she freaked out, but my mom was like, that's your great-grandmother. Yeah. Yeah.
Gosh.
Yeah.
I have a real
But at the
quick
time,
story here.
Oh,
Go
please.
ahead. No, it's also about faces. It's someone looking in, and it's very weird. I have these cousins who live out in the country, and this is out in the Philippines. I see them maybe about 6 or 7 years at a time. I mean, 6 or 7 years apart, because they're 22 hours away by plane. So that's like 10,000 miles away. They live in the same house where they were raised. Eventually, a few of them had moved out, but they talk about this particular armoire. It's kind of like a very old antique, probably more than 100 years old, that has a door that has mirrors on it. And it is situated for some reason in a spare bedroom that's in the very center of the house. So if you picture a house that has 4 bedrooms, the 5th bedroom somehow is right in the middle of the house. And inside, when you open it, it's got an armoire. Before my grandmother passed away, she was very sick, and they put her in that bedroom next to that armoire. And she loved the armoire. She had all her clothing in there. And she always said, you know, these are one of the treasures, one of the heirlooms in the family. And, you know, when I pass, someone has to inherit it, never sell the house and have them take the armoire. So about a year later, she did pass away. And speaking of, you know, the image of someone, now, even today, when they open the door to that bedroom, and it's now basically a storage area, they keep everything kind of like away from that particular mirror. And when you look through the mirror, you could see someone's face on it. I don't know that it's my grandmother's face, but there's definitely someone's face. My cousin took a picture of it, and it's in the centerfold of my first book. And when people look at it, even people who just buy the book, they look at it and they see the face immediately on the lower left-hand side. I am the only one who cannot see that face in that mirror in real time or in the book.
Jeez.
Go figure.
Wow. Wow.
It is creepy.
It's strange. Yeah.
That is, yeah. That's
Well,
really creepy.
It is an hour and 50 minutes into our amazing Halloween special. So I guess I should ask each one of you guys what you've got going on and where people can find you and whatnot. So why don't you go ahead and tell us, Anna, what you got going on and how people can find you and find your amazing books.
Well, sure. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Probably the fastest way to find me is to type Haunted Heirlooms, because the latest book I have is about haunted antiques, which I just mentioned one of the stories. I also have another book coming out actually next month in November, which is called Unholy Structure. So the best way to find me is on Facebook. I also have a website, AnnaMariaManaloAuthor.com. Watch out for the latest release. It's called Unholy Structure.
Fantastic. Thank you. How about you, sir, Mr. Sam?
Well, this has been fun. We'll have to do it again for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You guys were great tonight, by the way. Thank you so much for doing this.
I had a blast.
Yeah, we'll have
to. It went by so fast, didn't it? I mean, wow.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah.
I had a bunch of other stuff just in case we had to fill some time, but I guess that's that'll be for next year. Golly, guys, that was great.
Yeah. Yeah, this has flown by. An hour became 2.
Yeah.
Bizarre. Well, you can find me on all of my social media. I'm not on TikTok though. I just haven't gotten around to it, I guess. Maybe I should. Maybe I shouldn't. But I am on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Patreon, YouTube, all of that jazz. Even Tumblr, I think. But you can find all of those links on one website, which is MrSamSheeran.com, and that's the word Mr. MISTER, Sam, like Uncle Sam, and then Sheeran, like Ed Sheeran, but spelt correctly, SAEARON.com. And so, yeah, you can look out for my new creepy Christmas cards. The 3rd season is coming out in a couple of weeks, so that's a whole new barrage of Christmas monsters.
Yeah, we should get you back on for Christmas. We'll have you on soon.
Right. Yeah, that'd be
if
fun.
you've got time, of course.
Yeah. Ho, ho, ho. That's me.
And Mr. Dean Bertram.
Yeah, I do a couple of different things. Just quickly, if there are any filmmakers out there or people who make paranormal type documentaries or the like, I run a film festival called Midwest Weird Fest in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. It's a blast and it's an awful lot of fun. Our regular deadline is on Monday, although there is a later deadline in December. So think about entering any content you've made, and that's midwestweirdfest.com, midwestweirdfest.com. So that's pretty easy to remember. Also, if you live in the Wisconsin area or all the Eau Claire area, think about coming to the fest. It's always a blast. There's lots of guests. It's the first weekend in March. But what I do most of the year, among other things, is 2 live streams and podcasts, which are now on the Untold Radio Network, and they're both at untoldradioam.com, the brainchild of Doug Hychek, who most of us know as the creator of Monster Quest. I have one show on there, which is a guest-orientated show, which actually both you, Vincent, and you, Sam, have both been on the past, but now it's on Untold Radio Network, and that's called Talking Weird, and I do that with my partner in Weird and girlfriend, Jen Durrell, every Saturday night at 10 p.m. Central, and I have a newer show on there as well called Mysterious Library, which is every 9 p.m. Central.
Wonderful
with the
show.
always... Yeah, well, thank you. You always watch, which I really appreciate, Vincent, with Jason McLean, and as the title perhaps suggests, we talk about all manner of weird books. Each week we pick one weird book, and it's, you know, everything from Bigfoot to UFOs to paranormal documentaries. We do other things in the library, articles and documentaries as well. But that's a blast. So check those shows out, along with a bunch of other shows on that network at untoldradio.am.com.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thanks again for all you guys coming out. And we'll have you guys back on, each one of you. So I'll be getting a hold of you very soon. And I just wanted to tell everybody tonight that Lon had a little bit of a surgery that he went through. It was planned. It was okay. He's through it. He's on the mend. And it's his birthday today. So happy birthday, Chief.
And
Happy birthday, Lon.
Happy birthday, Lon.
All right, guys. Well, I am going to say goodnight to you all. And me and Bernadette are going to talk to the audience for a moment and then close up the show. Well, thank you again.
Thank you, guys.
Each one of you guys. I really do.
It was
Have a
fun.
good night.
Happy Halloween,
Bye.
everybody.
Happy Halloween.
Nice to meet
All
you
right,
guys.
take care, guys.
It was nice to meet you too. Bye.
Nice to meet you.
All right. We'll all talk soon. Thank you.
Mhm.
All righty, Bernadette, it's you and I. Now, Bernadette will be premiering a new show soon. Bernadette, you want to give them a little time and a little taste of what you got coming up?
Sure. So next Friday, I believe, November 2nd.
November
I'll have
2nd.
Yeah, I want to say that's next. Yes. Wait. No, I'm sorry. November 4th. November 4th is
okay.
next Friday. Excuse me. Yes. So my first show will premiere November 4th, right after Lawns. And we will have the incredible Steve Stockton on. And we will be talking about missing persons and all of that fun stuff. So my goal with the show is to have basically the experiencers on, as well as researchers and writers. I do want to cover some true crime as well, because I'm interested in that.
Fine.
But mostly I want it to be experiencer orientated. So if anyone has experiences and they want to talk to me about it, you know, you can find me through Vincent. You can find me on Instagram at A Paranormal Life. I'm that on TikTok as well. You can reach out to me. Vince and I have talked about this. There's a way that if you don't want your face shown, but you still want to make your story public, we can work around that and do that. So, but it's going to be a lot of fun. I have a bunch of incredible people who've agreed to come on the show, and I'm so excited.
Yeah, we're excited to have it. It's going to be a great show.
Yeah.
And then sometime very soon, I'm going to also be having a show. It's going to be more conspiracy and alien driven. And I'm going to have some cryptozoology and different other kind of stories on there too. And it's going to be a whole lot of fun. Hopefully I'll have that maybe, we'll say mid-month for you guys.
I'm excited for that. Who doesn't love a good conspiracy?
Right. Who doesn't love a good conspiracy? And all you guys who know me personally, you know I'm a big tinfoil hatter. So it was great having everybody tonight. Wow, what a
It was
show.
so much
Once
fun.
again, I want to say happy birthday to the Chief. Happy birthday, Lon. I'm glad you're safe and at home and on the mend. And I'd like to say thank you, everybody, for coming out.
Happy
And please
birthday, Lon.
like, share, subscribe. If you made a donation tonight, that is very appreciated. Thank you very much. And we will be getting back with you, I believe, next Friday? Yeah.
Next Friday, Lon will be here next Friday. Yeah. And who's going to be on the
back
show?
in full swing, back in action.
Yeah. Do you know who's going to be on the show next Friday?
I don't have it in front of me, so no.
Good question.
It'll be up on the site here.
All right. So next Friday, Lon will be back in the seat at 9 p.m. Eastern. And then following him, I will be there at 10 p.m. Eastern. So stick around right after Phantoms and Monsters for A Paranormal Life.
That's true. And thanks everybody for coming out tonight. I think
Thank
tonight
you.
was pretty big success. What does the chat room think? Everybody have a good time? Wonderful.
Looks like it.
Well, until
Yeah.
next time, folks.
Yep.
You all have a lovely evening and have a great night, and we will see you then. Good night.
Night, everyone. Bye.